By the time Clara Hale reached the north gate, the baby on her chest had gone too quiet, not asleep. Too tired to cry, 3 ranch hands were wrestling with a down stretch of wire, while a string of yearlings pushed curious noses through the gap, and the old man shouting at them never noticed Clara until she stepped into the churned mud, picked up a pair of fencing pliers, and twisted the broken barb back into place with one clean motion. The wire tightened. The yearlings jerked their heads back. One of the men let go too late and nearly fell. Clara kept her eyes on the fence. "Please feed my baby," she said. "I'll mend your fences." The old rancher looked her up and down as if he had found a sparrow, volunteering to pull a wagon. She was narrow in the shoulders, dust-colored from the trail, boots cracked white at the creases. The baby was wrapped in a shawl that had once been blue. The bundle of her things was no bigger than a flour sack. "You know wire?" he asked. She cinched the twist one turn harder until the line gave a low metallic hum. "I know when it's tied wrong." One of the hands snorted. Another wiped his mouth with the back of his glove and stared at the baby as if that alone settled the matter. A woman with an infant did not ask for ranch work. She asked for a corner by the stove and maybe a crust, if people were kind, but Clara was already crouching at the next broken staple, studying the angle of the strain as though the fence were talking to her. The old man's name was Eben Rourke. By the look of his coat, his boots, and the way everyone waited for him even while pretending not to, he owned every board, beast, and blade of grass within sight of that gate. He also had the face of a man who had slept badly for years. The lines around his mouth looked carved, not grown. "What do you want for the feeding?" he asked. "A bowl for me, milk for her. Somewhere out of the wind tonight." Clara pointed with her chin to the north bench, not to the broken line in front of them. "And if you want the place standing by January, not just tonight, you need a fence up there before dark tomorrow." All 3 hands turned and looked. There was nothing up there but open ground. A shoulder of pale grass, a few stones, a long rise with no cattle on it and no reason to spend wood or labor on it. Eben squinted. "For what?" Clara shifted the baby's weight, then looked past him to the ranch buildings laid out below the rise. House, bunk shed, hay yard, calving barn, 2 corrals, well house, wagon track, all sitting broadside to the north, as if waiting to be judged. Beyond them stretched a shallow draw that looked harmless in dry months and murderous in snow. "The first real storm will tell you," she said. One of the men laughed out loud. "Storm's gonna ask that fence permission?" She ignored him. Her voice stayed flat, almost tired. "No. It'll bury your hay, wall your barn door, choke your stock lane, and freeze that trough harder than iron. Then you'll cut paths with shovels until your shoulders tear. If you have shovels left." The laughter died faster than it had started. Everyone on the plains knew what an early blue line in the northern sky could mean. It was only September, but the geese had already been flying low for 3 mornings. And the grass had a brittle edge to it by noon. Men who had lived in that country long enough did not laugh long at any prediction involving winter. Still, a fence in empty land was foolishness. Eben Rourke studied her for another moment, then said, "Feed the baby." It was not permission, not yet, but it kept her from being turned away. By sunset, Clara had a bowl of bean stew inside her, warm goat milk in the child, and a pallet on the kitchen floor near the stove. She also had every pair of eyes on the ranch, following her hands. She mended a snap trace on the milk cart before the cook finished ladling supper. She reset a hinge pin on the smokehouse door with a nail and a spoon handle. When one of the hands brought her the wrong gauge wire for the north line, she did not correct him with words. She bent it in half and pulled until it broke. Then she handed it back. "Too brittle," she said. "That'll fail on the first frost." By then, even the cook had stopped pretending not to listen. Her name moved through the house before she finished eating. Clara Hale. Child's name was Miriam. No husband in sight. Came from east of the Missouri by way of 2 towns nobody at the table had heard of. Asked for no pity. Asked for work. Deke Hollis, the foreman, waited until Eben finished chewing before he said what the rest were thinking. "You can feed a traveler," Deke said. "That doesn't mean you hand her lumber." Clara glanced toward the window. In the black glass, she could just make out the north rise. "You don't need lumber. Not good lumber." "What then?" "Your broken rails. The warped slats by the chicken yard. The cottonwood poles stacked by the wash gully. Wire. Rawhide if you've got it. Willow if you don't." Deke shook his head. For a fence that holds what? She dipped bread into the last of her stew. Snow. That earned a silence so complete the kitchen clock suddenly sounded enormous. Someone at the far end of the table muttered. I knew she was odd. Eben did not smile, but something sharpened in his face. You've done it before. Clara wiped the spoon clean with the bread. I've seen men stay alive because of it. I've seen smarter men refuse it and dig rail cuts out by hand until spring took half their fingers. Rail cuts? Deke asked. She did not answer that, not fully. She only looked down at the baby, now asleep with milk on her lip, and said, The wind does the same work everywhere if you give it the same shape. The ranch hands did not understand. That much pleased them, because not understanding made it easier to dismiss her. What they did understand was labor, and labor had numbers. One woman with a child was a burden. One extra pair of hands before winter might be useful, but using those hands on a fence no animal would ever lean against looked insane. Even Rourke set down his spoon. You mend what's broken tomorrow. If there's still light and you're still right, we'll see about your ghost fence. Deke opened his mouth to object. Eben raised one finger and ended it. Clara slept only in scraps that night. Miriam woke twice, hungry and then cold. The stove slackened after midnight. Somewhere outside, a hinge banged in slow, irregular beats. Around 3 in the morning, Clara got up without lighting a lamp, wrapped the baby, and stepped onto the porch. The ranch lay black and silver under a half moon. She stood still long enough to hear it breathing, loose board on the south shed, wind threading the corner of the hay yard, a gate chain knocking the post, dry weeds rasping in the draw. Farther out, the north rise held a curious hush, as if even the small night wind flattened there before it dropped toward the buildings. Clara looked not for movement, but for signs. Movement had once left behind. Last year's drift lines still marked the lower rails in chalky residue. Grass on the lee side of the corrals bent one direction, then another, telling the story of crosswinds and trapped snow. The north wall of the calving barn carried water stains higher than a man's waist. That was not rain. That was packed melt. By dawn, she knew the ranch's weakness better than some men who had ridden its fences for 10 years. The first thing she asked for after breakfast was a shovel handle. Deke stared at her. For what? To measure. With a shovel handle. It's straight, and you've got one. He handed it over with the expression of a man indulging harmless madness. Clara walked the rise above the ranch, with Miriam tied against her back and the handle in her hand like a surveyor's staff. She paced, stopped, scraped at the soil with her boot heel, paced again, then drove the handle upright in 3 places. Each time she stepped back and studied not the marker itself, but the country around it. Toby Marsh, the youngest hand on the place, had been sent to shadow her in case she stole a mule or wandered off. By noon he had forgotten to be suspicious. What are you looking at? He asked. Where the first drift wants to stand. He frowned at the empty grass. There's no drift. There was. There will be again. Toby was 16, long in the legs and red in the ears. At that age, when adults seem to guard every useful thought as if it were gold dust. He had expected her to speak like a beggar. Instead, she spoke like a carpenter, taking a wall apart in her head. How can you tell? Clara pointed with the shovel handle to a scatter of buffalo grass laid flat in a narrow crescent. See the lay? Not from cattle. Cattle rub and break. Wind combs. Snow pressed that line down after the grass died. Then she showed him the stones half buried on one side and scoured clean on the other. A drift seam along a low bank. Straw caught in the bottom wire of a fence 70 yards away, all threaded from the same direction. Told you, Toby said carefully. That don't say where to build. It only says where the storm's been. It says both if you know what steals your work. She placed him 20 paces downslope and made him face the ranch. What do you see first when you look at the barn? The barn. What's between you and it? Nothing. That's the problem. He squinted. It made no sense. Most people believed in protection you could lean against. Wall, hill, timber, bank. Clara seemed to believe in empty space. She studied the air between things as if it were timber not yet cut. By midday, Eben rode out to see whether she had run off with his shovel handle. He found her marking a line far above the barn lot. You'll put it there? He asked. Yes, it won't stop stock. It isn't for stock. It's too far from the buildings to block wind. That's why it'll work. He glanced at Deke, who had followed up the rise with the expression of a man heading toward proof that would save him the trouble of arguing later. Explain, Eben said. Clara took a breath, but only enough for half an answer. If you put a barrier where the snow is already at your door, all you've made is a better place to stack trouble. You have to make winter spend itself before it reaches what matters. Deke folded his arms. Spend itself. She nodded toward the north horizon. Look at a running horse sometime. If you jerk him hard, he'll fight the bit. Ease him into the turn, he takes it, wins the same. Stop it dead and it climbs, curls, throws what it carries wherever it pleases. Ease it, and it lays the load down where you choose. Toby stared at her, as if she had said the wind could read. Deke said, "That sounds clever enough to waste wood with." Eben kept looking at the line she had marked. The old man had lost cattle before. Lost time. Lost men's good temper. Lost whole mornings to cutting paths after storms when every cold minute meant another problem waiting. He knew what it cost to be wrong. He also knew what it cost to keep doing the same thing because it was familiar. "How high?" he asked. Not high as a corral, open as a bad smile, more empty than wood. This time even Eben's mouth twitched. By late afternoon, the ranch had divided itself into two camps. The first camp thought Clara Hale was a capable vagrant with odd ideas, and odd ideas were luxuries winter did not permit. The second camp thought that if Eben Rourke was willing to gamble scraps on her ghost fence, it would at least be entertainment before freeze-up. Clara worked as if she had no stake in winning any argument at all. That unsettled people more than stubbornness would have. She spent the daylight hours mending real fences first. That mattered. She straightened posts, tied off broken wire, reset braces, and taught Toby how to twist a repair, so strain tightened it instead of undoing it. When he asked where she had learned to work that fast, she said, from people who could not afford slow mistakes. Only after the necessary work was done did she turn to the foolish work. They scavenged broken cottonwood poles from a collapsed sheep pen, wagon slats from behind the machine shed, and warped boards nobody had bothered to burn, because even flames deserved better fuel. Clara laid everything in rows and sorted it by length, not prettiness. Then she sent Toby for willow switches from the creek bottom and asked Lucinda Varela, the cook, for any rawhide strips left from mending harness. Lucinda, a widow who had fed half the county through one bad season or another, handed them over without comment. But when Clara thanked her, Lucinda said, "If you're wrong, they'll say it's because you're a woman. If you're right, they'll say it's because the storm wasn't much." Clara tucked the rawhide into her pocket. "Then I'd best be useful again after that." Lucinda looked at the baby, sleeping in a laundry basket by the stove. Good answer. The first section went up crooked, by ordinary ranch standards. Not careless crooked. Intentional crooked. Clara angled the line slightly off square from the rise, and Deke grumbled every nail stroke of the way. Straight would be stronger. "Straight to what?" she asked. "To the post." "I'm not talking to the post." That kind of answer made Deke want to dislike her. It was harder to do after he saw how she lashed the slats. She left spaces between them. Wide, regular, deliberate spaces. "A fence with holes," one hand said. "A coat with holes is cheaper too." Clara said nothing. She kept laying the slats with gaps enough to see daylight, each tied to the poles with wire or rawhide, the bottom raised a little from the ground. When the men protested that snow would blow right through, she only said, "Some of it should." By evening, the thing stood on the north rise like the frame of a wall a sane person would finish tomorrow. 8 poles, slatted face, air all through it, no cattle near it, no gate, no purpose anyone could respect. Toby thought it looked like a giant drying rack. Deke called it kindling with opinions. Eben rode up at sunset, rested one hand on the pommel, and stared at the structure while the sky behind it bruised purple. "That all?" "For the first line," Clara said. "You need more? One line makes one answer. Winter asks more than one question." He let out a slow breath through his nose. "You do like talking in knots." Clara adjusted Miriam against her shoulder. "No, sir, I just haven't shown you enough yet." The storm came sooner than even she had expected. It was not the great winter. Not yet. Just a hard trial run sent 2 nights later by a front that arrived with dust, then sleet, then snow that blew almost sideways across the bench. Men who had been laughing at supper went quiet by the time the lanterns were lit. Doors had to be shouldered shut. Horses turned their rumps to the dark. The north wall of the house made a low complaining sound before midnight as the wind found every seam. Clara did not try to sleep. She fed Miriam, tied her close, and sat on the kitchen floor with Lucinda while the stove pulsed red and the rafters ticked overhead. Around dawn, Deke shoved through the back door, packed with cold, face white with blown snow. "Barn door's clear," he said. Lucinda looked up from the coffee pot. "Well, it's a barn door. That's usually the idea." Deke ignored her. He was looking for Clara. Hay yards drifted. North path isn't. Clara rose so quickly Lucinda reached to take the baby first. Outside, the world had been redrawn. Snow lay in hard curves and scalloped ridges across the open ground. The north rise held a long white back like a sleeping beast, and along the lee of Clara's strange fence stood the thing she had been expecting, a deep, deliberate drift growing exactly where the empty line had been placed, far enough from the barn lot that the path between remained wind-brushed and passable, not bare, never bare in that country, but open enough to walk without climbing. The barn door, which last year had taken 4 men and 2 shovels to free after the first big blow, opened with one hand. Toby reached it first and shouted as if a race had been won. Deke said nothing at all. He just kept looking from the drift to the barn to the drift again, measuring disbelief against visible snow and losing. "It's one storm," he said at last. Clara nodded. Yes. That annoyed him more than if she had crowed. He wanted arrogance so he could fight it. She only sounded like a woman noting the hour. The hay yard, though, had drifted badly along its north edge, because there was no fence there but the yard's own solid planks, and the snow had poured over them and packed hard against the stacked feed. Clara crouched and dug her gloved hand into the drift, then into the hay beneath where the edge had gone damp. "This will rot if it sits and freezes, then thaws, then freezes again," she said. Deke frowned. "Snow don't rot hay, water does." Clara looked at him. "And what is snow planning to become?" Toby gave a short, guilty laugh before he could stop himself. Even Deke's mouth almost moved. Before noon, Clara had marked a second line, this one longer and slightly farther out from the hay yard than anyone liked. It angered the men on principle. The first fence had worked once, which did not make the second any less foolish. Now she wanted labor during prime winter prep days, and labor was dearer than lumber. Eben Rourke stood in the yard, gloves tucked into his belt, and listened to both sides. Deke wanted to finish caulking the well house and bring the south herd down 2 weeks early. Clara wanted another slatted fence upwind of the hay, plus a shorter wing line near the draw where the feed wagon track dipped. "Why the track?" Eben asked. "Because if the drift forms across it, you'll still have hay and no way to reach it." Deke said, "Or, we'll have no hay because we spent 2 days building something meant for snow instead of stock." Clara looked out over the yard. "If I'm wrong, you lose 2 days and some scrap wood. If I'm right, you keep the winter where you can survive it." "What makes you so certain?" Deke snapped. She took a moment before answering. When she did, her voice had softened in a way that made everyone else quiet. "Because I watched men curse the same thing in a cut north of Bismarck," she said. "They built walls where they wanted none of the snow, so the wind threw it straight into their rails and buried the track to the telegraph poles. Then another crew built slat fences on the rise above the cut, far back where sensible men said they were useless. First crew spent February digging. Second crew spent it indoors. That was the first real piece of herself she offered, and even then it came wrapped in work, not confession. No one asked what took her from a railroad cut to a cattle ranch with a child and no companion. The plains were full of stories too costly to tell. Eben made his choice before the silence turned into pity. "Build the second line." Deke's jaw tightened. Clara lowered her gaze, not in gratitude, but in acceptance of the burden that came with being allowed to be right. Permission was only the start. Now she had to prove herself again. That second fence took longer. The boards were worse. The posts had to go into ground already crusting hard by morning. Miriam cried on and off through the workday with sore gums and a cough that made Clara's hands go faster. More than once she had to stop, slip into the lee of the wagon, and feed the baby under her shawl while men hauled posts past pretending not to notice. Those moments mattered on the ranch more than anyone admitted. It is easy to admire competence when it arrives in a body that resembles your own. Harder when it comes wrapped around need. Clara did not ask the men to pity what she carried. She only kept building through it. Toby became her first believer, though he never would have used that word. He saw the way she noticed small things before trouble ripened. The grit pattern where blown snow had started to gather against a rock. The way the horses came in with frost, only on one side of their whiskers after a north blow. The direction a torn feed sack skittered before snagging on sage. She was always reading signs most people stepped over. By mid-October, the ranch had 3 of her strange fences. One above the barn lot, one guarding the hay yard from a distance, one shorter wing catching the drift before it could fold into the wagon track at the draw. Other work continued because it had to. Cattle came down from the outer pasture. Harness was greased, the smokehouse filled with salted pork and a string of antelope that Deke and Toby brought in after a 2-day ride. Lucinda boiled jars and packed rendered lard into stone crocks, even balanced accounts by lantern light and frowned deeper each night. That was when Clara noticed the real illness at the center of the ranch. It was not in the stock. It was in the numbers. Rourke Ranch had land, cattle, hay, men, and buildings. But it also had debt carried over from 2 poor years and a spring flood that had taken half the footbridge and one whole seed wagon. If winter ran expensive, the bank in town would not care how bravely anyone had fought it. A ranch could die by inches without losing a single man to the cold. Clara saw that sooner than Eben guessed. One evening, after she had put Miriam to sleep in a drawer padded with folded towels, she found him at the table with the ledger open and the lamp turned low. "You count like a carpenter," he said without looking up. "How can you tell?" "You keep glancing at the margins where a woman who can't add wouldn't be looking." She stepped closer. "You're short on purchased hay. Are you reading upside down too?" "Enough." He leaned back. "I'll buy it if I must." "With what?" Eben finally looked at her. His eyes were not offended, only tired. "That's a large question for a woman I hired for soup." Clara glanced toward the window where the dark north rise was invisible now, though its influence seemed to press against the glass. "Then let me earn more than soup." He closed the ledger but did not dismiss her. She said, "If the snow falls where I think it will, and if it stays where I want it, your spring water changes." "What does spring water have to do with feeding cows in January?" "Everything, if summer burns early again." That was too far ahead for most men in October. Winter demanded immediate obedience. The idea of using winter itself to bargain with spring sounded either visionary or insane. Eben rubbed his thumb along the ledger edge. "I've had men promise me calves they hadn't bred yet. I'm not fond of future miracles." Clara shook her head. "Not a miracle. Storage. Of snow. Yes." He watched her for a long moment, then smiled without any joy in it. "You really do mean to run this place with fences no animal can touch?" "Only if nature agrees." That answer pleased him more than certainty would have. Men who lived long in harsh countries learned to distrust anyone who spoke, as if the land had already surrendered. The next trouble did not come from the weather. It came from pride. Hal Grissom from the neighboring place rode over on a bright cold morning, saw the slatted lines standing above the ranch like giant fish skeletons, and laughed so loudly his horse flinched. "You're charging drift rent now, Eben?" Eben, who disliked explanations before breakfast, simply said, "New hand's idea." Grissom turned to find the hand, and visibly enjoyed the surprise when it was Clara lifting a milk pail from the well. "Is that so?" he said. "Are you taking fence lessons from mothers now?" Clara set the pail down carefully. "Only if the fathers still need them." Toby nearly choked, trying not to grin. Grissom dismounted and walked one of the fences, as if inspecting a bad joke. "Won't hold sheep. No, won't stop wind. Not entirely." "Then what does it do?" Clara glanced toward the north horizon, where a pale smear already hinted at another front. "Wait." Men like Hal Grissom found patience insulting. He spat into the grass and said he'd rather trust a solid wall than a fence that apologized for being built. Then he rode off with the ease of a man, leaving behind a story he planned to retell in town for the price of a drink. Deck watched him go. "If this fails, I'll hear about it till my teeth fall out." Clara took up the pail again. "If it works, he'll pretend he thought of it." That made Deke laugh despite himself. It was the first clean piece of laughter he had offered her, and the sound changed something small between them. Not trust. Not yet. But usefulness recognized usefulness, and that was often the beginning of peace. By the first week of November, the fences had started doing something even the skeptics could not deny. They made the ranch look different before storms, not just after. Wind striking the north rise no longer raced uninterrupted into the yard. It broke, softened, spread. Dust moved in new lines. Fallen leaves gathered in patterns no one had seen the year before. Even the dogs chose different places to curl when the air sharpened. Clara spent those days not celebrating, but adjusting. She shifted one short wing fence 5 post widths east. After noticing a curl forming toward the wagon shed, she lowered the bottom gap on another section with extra willow weave where blown crust was sneaking under. She sent Toby to trim sage in one swale because the brush was catching early drift too close to the track. Every improvement created another question, exactly as she had known it would. That was what separated craft from luck. Luck worked once. Craft required revision. One afternoon, while resetting a post, Clara found Toby watching her with open frustration. "What?" He kicked at a frozen cloud. "I thought once it worked, you'd be done." "Done with what?" "Fixing it." She drove the post harder. "If you think being right means you stop looking, you haven't met winter." The words stayed with him. So did the image of her baby, strapped under a blanket on Clara's back, while the woman stood in biting wind tapping snow crust with her boot and changing the future by half a shovel handle. The deeper cold arrived with no ceremony. One morning, the water bucket by the porch had skinned over thick enough to hold a pebble. The pump handle burned flesh through gloves. Cows breathing in the pre-dawn looked like small engines idling in the dark. That same week, Miriam's cough worsened. Clara hid her worry badly. She worked harder, fed the child in shorter, more frequent spells, slept sitting upright so the baby could breathe easier against her. Lucinda brewed onion syrup and mustard plaster, then ordered Clara to sit by the stove for an hour while she watched the milk boil. Clara refused the hour. Lucinda took the baby anyway and said, "You can be useful tired or useful after soup. Choose." Clara stood there a moment, hands empty for the first time all day, and looked suddenly young, not weak, just stripped of one layer of will. She sat, ate, closed her eyes for perhaps 3 minutes. When she opened them, even Rourke was standing in the kitchen doorway with his hat in both hands. "Deke says the lower draw fence is drifting wrong." Clara rose so quickly, Lucinda clicked her tongue. Eben added, "After you finish your soup." That was the first time anyone on the ranch had delayed a work decision for her sake, and made it sound like an order rather than mercy. She obeyed. At the lower draw, the problem revealed itself at once. A crosswind from the northwest, sharper than the earlier fronts, had begun feeding snow around the wing fence and into the wagon track from an angle Clara had underestimated. Not enough to bury it yet. Enough to warn her, Deck waited with the shovel in hand. "You guessed wrong." "Yes," she said. He blinked. He had expected defense. Clara walked the drift edge, crouched and scraped at the layering with her glove. Fine grains below, heavier crust above. New direction in the top band. The storm had turned mid-blow. She stood. We moved the wing. Not far. Just enough to pull the nose off the track. Deke leaned on the shovel. "You say that like it's easy. It isn't, but being wrong early is cheaper." He studied her for a moment. "You don't mind saying it." "Why would I?" "Snow knows already." That answer finally won him over. Not because it was clever, but because it contained the humility all hard country demands. She was not fighting the land with pride. She was bargaining with observation. They moved the fence by lantern light. It worked. The next storm split around the adjusted line and dropped its weight where she had wanted it, leaving the wagon track narrow but open. Deke spent the entire next morning pretending he had believed her since October. By then, the ranch had begun using her language without noticing. Men said a corner wanted to drift. A bank was spending snow wrong. The space above the calving barn became Clara's pocket, because she said the Hildebeer tucked wind like a folded blanket if the approach was shaped properly. That did more for her place on the ranch than any praise. Belonging rarely arrives in speeches. It arrives when other people begin to think with the tools you brought. December closed in hard. One squall froze 3 steers to the creek bank at a neighbor's place, because they bunched under a bluff and could not turn when the drift packed their legs. Another storm peeled part of the roof off the blacksmith shed, and Clara spent half a day helping nail it back under a sky the color of old tin. 2 of the ranch dogs came home bloodied from tangling with a hungry cat near the chicken yard. Feed had to be measured. Firewood had to be split smaller, because the green cottonwood smoked badly and made less heat than it promised. Nature did not care that a few fences had done well. It kept asking larger questions. So did the people. Aben wanted to know whether the North Pasture Stock Lane could be protected enough to move cattle through during a real blow. Deck wanted to know if the hay stacks by the east lot should be banked higher or left to breathe. Lucinda wanted to know whether the drift now forming beyond the house would flood her cellar come thaw. Toby wanted to know everything, especially the parts Clara had not yet said out loud. She answered each one through work. For the stock lane, she added 2 shorter slatted lines, staggered rather than continuous, explaining only that a single long fence could make one large problem if the wind changed, while broken lines sometimes gave the storm smaller mouths to fill. For the haystacks, she kept snow from packing wet against the base by forcing the first drift to settle farther out. For Lucinda's cellar, she dug a shallow diversion scrape by hand, so spring melt would peel away from the foundation instead of straight into the root shelves. Not another invention, Deke muttered, though without heat. Same invention, Clara said. Different season, and that was the truth of it. The forgotten method was never just about winter. It was about directing force before force became damaged. Snow was only frozen water moved by air. If you could place it, delay it, thin it, or deepen it where it served you, you were not merely surviving the weather. You were storing labor. Still, Clara would not say the whole thing yet. She kept the deepest answer hidden under demonstration, because talk alone never persuades people the way necessity does. Christmas came quiet on the ranch, if quiet can include hammering ice from a pump and pulling a half-frozen calf before dawn. Lucinda baked biscuits from flour she had been stretching since autumn. Toby whittled a small horse for Miriam from scrap pine. Deke shaved, which made everybody uncomfortable. Eben opened a bottle he had been saving long enough that no one asked what occasion it had first belonged to. At supper, Clara laughed for the first time anyone there could remember. Miriam, drowsy with fever, finally gone, smeared biscuit crumbs through her own hair and tried to feed them to the carved horse. The sight broke something open in the room. For one evening, the ranch felt less like a place under siege and more like a rough household assembled by accident and kept together by work. Then the old line rider, Moss Tally, came in after dark with snow in his beard and a warning that ended the holiday. North's building means, he said. The barometer dropped like a stone, crows all sitting low in the creek cottonwoods. I'd bring anything in that you still want standing. Eben looked at Clara. That alone told everyone how much had changed since the gate. She did not answer at once. She went to the window, though there was nothing to see but black and her own dim reflection holding a child. Then she turned back and said, "Not everything comes in." Deke frowned. "If this is about those fences again, it is. And the cattle. And the hay. And the spring line below the east field. If the storm comes the way Moss says, the wind won't be the worst of it. It'll be the duration." "How long?" Eben asked. Moss rubbed his jaw. "Could be a day. Could be 3. Feels like one of those that forgets to move on." Clara nodded, as if that confirmed something she had been fearing. Then she began giving orders. No suggestions. Orders. Move the pregnant heifers to the lower lot, where the staggered fences made a quieter pocket. Shift the wagon tongue south, so they would not freeze into the drift seam above the draw. Cover the well house latch with burlap to keep blown ice from sealing it. Stack split kindling in both barn and kitchen now, not tomorrow. Put axes in 3 places, not 1. Hang 2 extra lanterns already trimmed in the calving shed. Bring the weak mare from the east pen to the barn tonight, no matter how much she hated stalls. Scrape a shallow trench from the cellar drain to the yard. Tie a rope line from house porch to barn corner before the wind rose enough to take direction from a man's eyes. The speed with which everyone moved would have been impossible 2 months earlier. Deke caught himself halfway through repeating one of her orders and looked almost offended that he had obeyed before arguing. Then he finished repeating it anyway. All through the next day, the ranch tightened itself. Clara walked every fence line she had built, adjusting where needed, kicking at the lower gaps, checking, lashings, testing, posts with both hands. Toby followed, carrying tools and trying not to show that he was frightened. The sky had gone white in a way that erased distance. The air before the storm felt too still, as if the country had taken one breath and held it. At the long fence above the hay yard, Toby said what he had been saving. "What if this is the one it doesn't work on?" Clara put her shoulder to a post, felt it hold, then stepped back. Then we learn fast. That doesn't comfort me. It wasn't meant to. He swallowed. Why do you always talk like winter can hear you? She looked out over the pale rise. Because it answers. He wanted some hidden talisman then, some last secret she had not yet given them. But all she did was send him back for more wire. Survival rarely looks mystical up close. It looks like repetition and checking, and one more trip through the cold when your hands are already numb. The storm struck after dusk, like a train entering a tunnel. 1 hour there were stars. The next, there was only white force battering walls and roofs, and every weak intention men had hammered together since October. The first night passed in chores measured not by clock, but by urgency. Keep the stove fed. Check the barn. Check the rope line. Break ice. Calm the mare. Feed the dogs indoors because they would otherwise vanish. Repack the door where fine snow was sifting under the threshold. Listen for anything that sounded different, because different often meant trouble before dawn. Miriam woke screaming once, when a gust hit the house broadside and made the window sash clatter. Clara held her close beneath a blanket and counted the pauses between gusts without realizing she was doing it. Around midnight, Deke and Eben fought the kitchen door open against packed snow and came in with frost on their eyebrows. The north path is still passable, Deke said. Drift's grown higher than the fence itself. Clara nodded. That was expected. A good drift always tries to hide the tool that made it. Hay yard? Reachable. Stock lane? Eben answered this time, and there was something like astonishment under the fatigue. Quieter than the yard, like the wind gets broken before it finds them. Lucinda set coffee in their hands and told them to stop standing there dripping on her floor. By the second day, the storm had turned from violence to endurance. That was worse. Any fool can plan for a hit. Few plan well for being slowly worn down. The house lost all sense of morning and evening. Windows turned to glowing squares of white, and then to gray, and then black again. Men moved from chore to chore, with snow rimed in the folds of their coats. Horses steamed in the barn and pawed nervously. One heifer began calving 2 weeks early because nature enjoys bad timing. Clara slept perhaps an hour at a stretch. At noon, when Deke reported that the main drift above the barn had grown like a cliff, Toby finally blurted the question he had been carrying for months. "Why there?" he said. "Why does it keep piling there and not here?" Clara shouldered into her coat. "Come see." They stepped into a world reduced to 10 yards and a rope line. Snow drove past, not as flakes, but as endless, fast dust. Bent low, they reached the lee side of the first big fence. The drift towering there rose well over Toby's head now, smooth on one face, curled on the other, enormous and deliberate. Clara planted the shovel handle into it. "You wanted to know," she said over the wind. "Here's why." She pointed first to the slats, nearly buried at the center where the drift had climbed. A solid wall slaps the wind. Make it leap and curl. Then it scours one place and buries another wherever it loses its temper. But this, she hit the slatted fence with her glove. This bleeds the force. Not all at once. Enough to make the air let go of what it carries. Toby squinted, snow sticking to his lashes. "See the shape? It starts before the fence, keeps building after. That means the wind is slowing, not stopping. Snow falls when air loses the strength to hold it. We don't fight that. We choose where we get tired." She dragged the shovel handle through the drift and pointed down toward the barn lot beyond. The ground there, though blasted and crusted, lay far shallower. Put the fence too near what you're saving, and the drift reaches it anyway. Put it high and far enough, and the storm unloads here. All winter, it unloads here. That buys you a path, a door, a lane, a roof edge that doesn't break, hay you can still reach, animals that don't stand in a whirlpool of snow. Toby stared at the white wall, the way a person looks at a trick after finally understanding where the hands were. "It's not stopping winter," he said. "No, it's placing it. Yes." That was the answer the whole story had been hiding, and hearing it in the teeth of the storm made it feel less like theory than law. Deke, who had followed them out and heard every word, slapped the fence once with his mitten. "We built a place for the trouble to sit." Clara looked at him through the blown snow. "Exactly. It was too late in the storm for pride to survive." Now even the skeptics wanted only the usefulness of what she knew. Nature was still not done. That night, the mare in the barn cast her halter and nearly broke a stall board. The weak calf from the early heifer went cold and had to be rubbed hard with burlap and fed warm milk through a rag. The east spring line began to freeze, where the blown crust had exposed a shallow section Clara had warned about, but did not have time to deepen before the storm. She and Deke crawled out with shovels and straw after midnight, dug to the line by lantern light, and banked it as best they could. Not perfect, Deke panted. No, Clara said. Enough. That became the word of the storm. Enough wood, enough feed, enough open path, enough warmth, enough air in the calf's lungs, enough strength in a post. Enough hope to keep making the next small correction. On the third morning, Hal Grissom appeared out of the whiteness on a lathered horse that could barely lift its knees through the drifted yard. Everyone knew at once it was bad. He came in with one side of his face raw from wind and said his hay was buried to the top rails. His barn lot had drifted shut on the north side, and he had lost 12 head in the far shelter because they'd packed too tight against a solid plank break and smothered when the drift climbed over them. Then he saw through the kitchen window that the path to the Rourke hay yard still ran open enough for a sled. The look on his face was not humiliation. It was worse, understanding. He turned to Clara, the same woman he had laughed at in the yard, and said the hardest sentence a certain type of man ever says. "Will you come look?" She did not answer right away. Miriam was asleep in Lucinda's arms. Deke had blood on one cuff from the calf. Aben looked as if he had aged 3 winters in 3 days. The ranch still needed her, but Hal Grissom had ridden through that storm because he had run out of self-respect to spend on doubt. Clara asked, "How many sound horses?" 2. "Any slats? Rails? Wire?" "Some." "Then I'll look. Not for long." Eben started to object, then stopped himself. Leadership had shifted so gradually he only noticed the handover in moments like that when he found himself waiting for a woman he had once fed for charity to decide how his day would go. They tied rope from porch to yard, checked the drifts, fed the stock, and by noon Clara rode with Deke and Hal across a country flattened under white and wind. Grissom's place showed the cost of old thinking everywhere. His main windbreak sat too close to the barn, so the drift had stacked directly against the north doors. The hay yard's solid planks had created a curling deposition that sealed the access lane while leaving ugly scour at the base of the stacks. The stock shelter in the west lot had blocked wind exactly enough to make the cattle bunch where the snow then buried them. Clara walked the place in silence. Hall kept talking, as frightened people do. "I thought it was safe, though the solid was stronger, though if I stopped the wind at the wall, that was the end of it." Clara knelt by the barn drift and cut a clean slice with her shovel so he could see the packed layers. "You gave it nowhere to lay down early," she said, "so it spent itself where you stood." He looked at the snow profile like a sermon written just for him. There was no saving the whole winter that day. No one could rebuild a ranch in the middle of a storm. But Clara marked 2 emergency lines above his yard and one staggered approach to the stock lot, using whatever junk wood he had. Enough to redirect the next wave. Enough to open a path to his hay if the wind eased even slightly. Enough to turn disaster from absolute to partial. On the ride back, Deke said nothing for almost a mile. Then, "You were right, and I hated you for it some." Clara pulled her scarf lower so she could breathe easier. "I know." He glanced over. "You don't seem surprised. Most people hate being shown the cost of habit." He grunted. "Is that so?" "Yes." "Me too." He nearly smiled. "That makes you more tolerable." By the 4th day, the storm broke, not all at once. The wind simply forgot its fury, then remembered somewhere else. Snow still fell in fine grains at dawn, but by noon the sky lifted, the ranch emerged, and the sun struck the drifts so bright men had to squint through watering eyes. What nature revealed then settled every remaining argument. The great drift on the north rise stood where Clara had predicted, massive and smooth, having taken into itself the burden that would otherwise have buried the barn lot. The hay yard lane remained narrow but open. The wagon track through the draw could still be worked. The lower stock pocket held trampled, sheltered ground instead of a deadly churn. The house cellar had drained because of the ugly little scrape Clara had cut weeks earlier, when nobody was looking. Elsewhere, damage appeared exactly where old assumptions had remained. Snow wedged under the wagon shed eaves where she had not had enough scrap to extend protection. One of the east fences blew partly loose because a post had gone into shallow stone. The spring line still slushed and refroze in one exposed section. Clara inspected everything with the same cool eye she had used on her successes. Nothing taught her less because it had gone well, and nothing taught her more because it had gone badly. She only kept adding facts. They dug out for 2 straight days. That labor should have been backbreaking, and some of it was, but it was controlled labor, not panic. That made all the difference. Men cleared paths they could predict. They opened drifts that were where they were supposed to be. They reached hay by routes the storm had not stolen. Each hour spent shoveling bought another hour of ordinary ranch work, instead of merely restoring what weather had erased. By contrast, word came from town that 2 outfits east of the river had spent an entire day just finding their stable doors. The evidence accumulated quietly. Firewood stacks lasted longer because less time was spent exposing the house to repeated digging and hauling in bitter wind. Feed losses dropped because hay stayed drier. Stock came through with less panic weight, lost from fighting deep yard drifts. Even the horses stayed sounder because they were not being forced through chest-high snow to do work that could have been avoided by placing the storm elsewhere months before. It was survival, yes. But it was also efficiency, labor economy, structural foresight, moisture control, and a kind of primitive engineering almost nobody on those ranches had ever been taught to see as one connected thing. That was why the method had been forgotten. It was too plain once explained. People prefer mysteries to disciplines. January tested them again with bitter cold that turned spilled water to glass before it hit the dirt. February sent a wet, heavy snow that sagged lesser roofs across the county. Clara's fences answered both differently. In the dry cold, the controlled drifts stayed where they were supposed to and continued protecting paths and lots by taking the depth up high. In the wet snow, the fences reduced the heavy loading that would have slammed against the vulnerable north walls and doors if allowed to build close. Where roof danger remained, Clara had men pull accumulation early because she now understood exactly which pockets grew fastest. By then, nobody asked whether she ought to direct them. They asked where to stand. Even Eben Rourke. Especially Eben Rourke. One evening in late February, he found her on the porch at sunset, Miriam bundled in her lap, the two of them watching the long blue shadows stretch from the white ridges that the fences had made. "You know," he said, "when you came to my gate, I thought I was deciding whether to feed you." Clara kept looking outward. "And now? Now I think you were deciding whether to save this place." She did not answer quickly. Compliments were harder for her than cold. Finally, she said, "I was deciding whether your land could be taught." He barked a laugh, then coughed from the dry air. "And could it? It listens better than people. That's fair." He eased down onto the porch step beside her. It took effort. Age had become more visible that winter, not less. "Bankman comes in April. I guessed. I won't need to buy hay after all." "No. If the thaw runs the way you say, the East Meadow greens first." "Yes. If the calves hold and the mares don't founder, I'll come through." She turned then, finally, and looked at him. "You'll come through because you let yourself be wrong before the weather forces it." That landed deeper than praise. Aben tipped his head once, accepting it. In March, the sun began to bite the drifts from the south side first. Water whispered under the crust. Roof edges dripped. Men who had lived half a year with shoulders up around their ears began to move like joints still belonged to them. This was where Clara's strangest prediction waited. All winter long, the big drifts above the ranch had looked like only one thing: stored trouble. Now they are stored in water. Because the snow had been made to gather high and deliberate on chosen ground, melt did not arrive as random loss. It arrived as a reserve. Clara cut channels where needed, opened the earlier drain near the cellar wider, and sent Toby and Deke to clear the line toward the east meadow so the first strong thaw would spread, not gouge. The ranch hands, who had spent months watching snow as enemy, had to learn to read it again as future grass. When the first warm week finally broke the heavy crust, the proof came in silver sheets, moving exactly where Clara had promised they would. Water ran from the managed drifts down through the planned swales, filled the stock pond without blowing out its bank, soaked the east meadow instead of bypassing it, and left the root cellar dry. Lucinda stood in the yard, with skirts hitched, and stared at the shining channels as if someone had turned winter inside out. Toby laughed outright. "You stored the whole storm." Clara shook her head. "No. We stored enough. That spring moisture changed the ranch as much as surviving the winter had. Grass came sooner in the east meadow. The pond held better into May. Purchased feed needs dropped again because pasture recovery began on time. The bank man, who had arrived expecting a strained smile and a delayed note, instead found stock in fair shape, hay losses lower than neighboring outfits, and a calm old rancher who no longer looked like a man negotiating with disaster. He also found Clara in the yard directing the placement of new posts for a permanent spring fence line. The bank man asked Eben who the foreman was. Eben did not miss a beat. "That depends," he said. "Are you asking who held the title in October, or who got us to April?" By then, even Deke laughed when people underestimated her. The real transfer of the ranch happened without ceremony. No speeches. No signed paper that afternoon. No dramatic handing over of keys as if ranches could be locked. It happened because a supply wagon arrived from town, and the driver asked Deke where to stack the new wire, and Deke said, "Ask Clara. She'll know what line gets it." It happened because Toby rode to the outer pasture and checked the posts she had marked rather than the ones anyone else might have chosen. It happened because Lucinda started sending questions about seed potatoes and smokehouse repairs to Clara first. Since Clara had already proved, she thought in seasons, joined together, not as separate emergency. It happened because Eben, when the breeding ledger came out and calving notes had to be matched against pasture condition, pushed the book across the table to her without remark. By spring, Clara Hale ran the whole ranch because everyone else had begun living inside the system she could see. That did not make her softer, or louder, or any less patient with wood, wire, and weather than with people. She still rose before dawn, still checked the lines herself after a hard night wind, still mended things before anyone asked if she noticed they were failing, still carried Miriam on her hip when the child grew old enough to point at every horse and call it hers. But the pleading at the gate was gone from her life. No one on the ranch fed her out of charity now. They ate because she had taught the place to survive in a way it had not known before. Hal Grissom came by twice that spring to study the Northrise fences after his own emergency lines had saved what remained of his hay yard. The second time he brought decent nails without being asked. "I'd like to build properly before next winter," he said. Clara handed him the shovel handle she still used to sight lines. "Then stop thinking about what you want the wind to do at the barn. Start where it reaches you first." He took the handle like a student receiving a ruler from a schoolmaster. It amused Deke terribly. Word spread farther after that. A ranch south of town copied the slatted design, but set it too near the shed and wondered why the drift still smothered the door. Clara rode over once, looked at it, and said only, "Distance matters as much as the fence." Another outfit built solid board snowbreaks because they liked the look better and discovered in one storm that Beauty was a poor engineer. That was always the temptation. To copy the shape without learning the reason. Clara never let her own crew make that mistake. She taught Toby and the others the principle underneath the boards. "Porous, not solid," she said. "Far enough to spend the storm before it spends on you. High ground if you can get it. Know your prevailing wind, but never trust it entirely. One big line if the land suits it. Broken lines if the ground or changing winds demand it. Watch the first small storm. Revise before the big one writes in ink." It sounded almost like doctrine, but on a ranch, every doctrine had to earn itself in mud and hunger and numbers. Hers had, when the last dirty banks of snow finally shrank into the gullies, and the Northrise turned from white to patched gold. Clara walked the fence line alone one evening, with Miriam toddling beside her, and falling every 6 steps in the softening ground. The great drifts are gone now. Only damp seams in the grass showed where they had stood. The slatted fence itself looked almost silly, without its winter work piled around it. Old boards, crooked gaps, posts weathered on one side more than the other. An ignorant eye would never guess that so much life had depended on something so plain. That, too, was part of the lesson. The most powerful survival knowledge in human history rarely announces itself as genius. More often, it looks like an odd habit, a crude tool, a structure built in the wrong place by someone the room is not ready to trust. Then the season turns. Nature tests everyone without favor. And one choice that seemed foolish in fair weather becomes the line between labor and exhaustion, stock and carcass, dry hay and rot, debt and survival. Miriam squatted by the bottom rail and patted the mud as if greeting an old friend. Clara lifted her, brushed her off, and looked back toward the ranch. Smoke climbed from the kitchen chimney in a steady blue thread. Men were moving in the yard with the loose confidence of people who believed the next season could be managed, not merely endured. The pond held light in its fuller basin. The east meadow already showed the first honest green. From the porch, Eben Rourke raised a hand. Clara raised hers back. Months earlier, she had come up that road asking for a bowl and a chance to mend one broken line. She had been thin, unwelcome, carrying a child and a knowledge no one there thought belonged to her. Now the ranch below existed in a new pattern because she had looked at empty space and seen where winter could be made to sit. That was the thing people finally understood. Not because she explained it prettily. Not because they wanted to be taught. Because the snow had testified. Because the doors had opened. Because the hay had stayed reachable. Because the cattle had kept their feet and breath. Because spring water had arrived where it was needed. Because labor that once vanished into where it was needed, though that vanished into repeated rescue, had been saved and spent on living instead. By the time the first meadowlarks returned to the fence posts, no one on Rourke Ranch called them ghost fences anymore. They called them the North Lines. And when new hands asked why in God's name a ranch would waste good posts on a slatted barrier so far from the barn, Toby Marsh would grin, rest both arms on the top rail, and answer with the kind of patience that only hard learning earns. Because that's where winter gets tired.